Imagine this: a picturesque church basking in golden afternoon sunlight. Guests are buzzing with excitement, their laughter and chatter filling the air. The bride looks stunning, her flowing white gown shimmering as she gracefully makes her way down the aisle. The groom? He can't stop smiling, his face radiating pure joy, until an unexpected voice pierces the moment, freezing everyone in their tracks. It's a boy, no older than 10, standing at the front of the aisle. He's small, nervous, and trembling, but his voice carries a conviction far beyond his years. "You can't marry her," he blurts out, his words echoing through the hushed sanctuary. The guests gasp. The bride's face tightens, and the groom's brows knit in confusion. All eyes turn toward the boy, his father's son, who now holds the entire wedding hostage with his stunning revelation. What happens next will shake this family to its core. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll see how a child's innocence unravels a chilling web of lies, deceit, and danger. And the twists? Let's just say they're the kind that will make you question how well you truly know the people closest to you. The morning light filtered through the bedroom window of a small suburban home, casting long golden streaks across the cluttered floor. Jacob stirred in bed, rubbing his eyes and listening to the hum of activity from the kitchen below. Today was the day. The day. His dad was getting married to Clara, the woman who had swept into their lives like a whirlwind 2 years ago. He sat up, his messy brown hair sticking out in all directions. At 10 years old, Jacob wasn't much of a morning person, but today, his stomach felt like a washing machine set to spin cycle. Was it nerves, excitement, or something else entirely? Downstairs, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sizzle of bacon. Tom, his dad, stood at the stove, humming a tune as he flipped pancakes. His usual work boots were traded for polished brown shoes, and he wore a crisp white shirt that made him look younger, happier even. "Morning, buddy." Tom greeted Jacob with a wide grin as the boy trudged into the kitchen, still in his dinosaur pajamas. "You ready for the big day?" Jacob shrugged, plopping down at the table and reaching for a pancake. "I guess," Tom chuckled. "What's with the long face? You're not nervous, are you?" Jacob chewed slowly, staring at his plate. How could he explain the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at him for weeks? He wanted to be happy for his dad. He really did. Tom deserved it after everything he'd been through, but something about Clara didn't sit right with Jacob. "She's nice, right?" Tom prompted, as if reading Jacob's mind. "Clara's been trying really hard to make you feel included." Jacob shrugged again, his voice barely above a mumble. "Yeah, she's nice." Tom sighed, setting the spatula down and crouching next to Jacob. "Listen, buddy, I know it's been a tough couple of years and maybe it's weird having someone new around, but Clara's a good person. She loves me, and she wants to love you too." Jacob looked into his dad's hopeful eyes and forced a nod. He didn't want to ruin his dad's happiness. "Okay, Dad, I'll try." The house buzzed with wedding day energy. Relatives arrived in waves, filling the living room with suitcases, garment bags, and bursts of laughter. Jacob's Aunt Lisa, Tom's older sister, bustled about, making sure everyone had coffee and that the suits were pressed. "Where's the little ring bearer?" she chirped, spotting Jacob hiding behind the banister. "Come here, kiddo. Let's make sure you're ready for your big moment." Jacob reluctantly stepped forward, allowing Aunt Lisa to fuss over him as she straightened his tie and smoothed down his unruly hair. "You look handsome," she said with a smile. "Clara's one lucky lady to be joining this family." Jacob offered a half smile, but his chest tightened. Did she really know Clara? Did anyone? His thoughts drifted back to the moments that had sparked his unease. The time he'd caught Clara on a late-night phone call, her voice sharp and unlike the bubbly persona she always displayed. The way she quickly shut her laptop whenever he walked into the room, and the small, almost imperceptible flicker in her smile when she thought no one was watching. Hours later, the family caravan made its way to the church. The small, picturesque building stood at the edge of town, its white steeple gleaming against the blue sky. Inside, rows of pews were decorated with soft white ribbons and vases of baby's breath. The faint sound of organ music floated through the air as guests began to fill the seats, their chatter creating a low hum of excitement. Jacob stood near the altar, holding the small satin pillow that bore the wedding rings. His dad was nearby, laughing with the groomsmen and looking more relaxed than Jacob had seen him in years. And then, Clara arrived. She swept into the church like a vision, her gown flowing behind her like liquid silk. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She smiled warmly at Tom, who beamed back at her as if she were the only person in the room. But Jacob saw something else. Her eyes, darting briefly to the side, seemed to scan the room as if she were looking for something or someone. It lasted only a second before her radiant smile returned, but Jacob caught it. "Doesn't she look beautiful?" Aunt Lisa whispered, nudging Jacob. He nodded mechanically, his mind racing. Something wasn't right. He didn't know what, but his instincts screamed at him to pay attention. The ceremony began, and Jacob stood stiffly at the front of the church, clutching the pillow with sweaty palms. As the minister spoke, he glanced around the room, searching for anything unusual. It was then that he noticed a man sitting alone in the back pew. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, his posture stiff and unnatural. Jacob frowned. The man didn't look like a guest. He wasn't smiling or clapping or even looking at the bride and groom. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Clara, and his jaw was set in a hard line. "Jake," Tom whispered, nudging him. "You good?" Jacob snapped out of his trance and nodded quickly. "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Every fiber of his being told him something was about to go wrong, and he was running out of time to figure out what. The wedding was now only a month away, and the house was bustling with preparations. Clara was everywhere, on the phone with florists, finalizing the guest list, and coordinating last-minute details. To anyone else, she was a picture-perfect bride. But to Jacob, her flawless exterior only made her harder to trust. One evening, Jacob sat cross-legged on the floor in his room, surrounded by his detective books. He had always loved mysteries, the kind where clever sleuths solved impossible cases with nothing but observation and intuition. His mom used to call him her little Sherlock, and he'd taken it to heart. Now, with Clara, he felt like he was living in one of those stories. The problem was, he wasn't sure if he was brave enough to find the answers. Late one night, Jacob tiptoed downstairs for a glass of water. The house was quiet except for the faint murmur of voices coming from the kitchen. As he approached, he recognized Clara's voice, but it sounded different. Gone was the bubbly, cheerful tone she always used with his dad. This was sharp, clipped, and cold. "I told you, I'm handling it," Clara hissed. "Do you think I want this mess following me here? Just stay out of it. I'll take care of him." Jacob froze, the glass trembling in his hand. Take care of who? His breath caught as he peeked around the corner. Clara was pacing the kitchen, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her face was tense, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if she knew she wasn't alone. When Jacob's foot accidentally scraped against the floor, Clara spun around, her expression shifting instantly. "Oh, sweetie," she said, her smile snapping into place. "Couldn't sleep?" Jacob nodded mutely, his throat dry. "Do you need a glass of water?" she asked, setting her phone down on the counter. He shook his head quickly. "No. I just, He backed away toward the stairs, clutching his empty glass. "I'm fine." Clara tilted her head, her smile lingering as she watched him retreat. "Good night, Jacob," she said sweetly, though her tone made his skin crawl. The next day, Jacob made a decision. If no one else could see what he saw, he would have to gather the proof himself. He pulled out an old spiral notebook and labeled the first page. Clara log. Underneath, he wrote, Day 1. Spotted Clara on a strange phone call. Said, I'll take care of him. Who? Why? Questions to answer. What does she do when Dad's not around? Where does she go on errands? Who was she talking to? He felt a surge of determination as he flipped to the next blank page. Every good detective needed evidence, and Jacob was determined to find it. Over the next week, Jacob started watching Clara closely. He pretended to be absorbed in his video games or homework, but he was always paying attention, taking mental notes of her movements, her expressions, the things she tried to hide. One of the first clues came on a Thursday afternoon. Clara had started a routine of going to yoga every week at the same time, always leaving with a brightly colored mat tucked under her arm. It seemed normal, except for the fact that she never returned sweaty or tired. "Yoga class must be relaxing," Tom joked one evening when Clara came home, her hair perfectly styled and her makeup flawless. Jacob said nothing, but his curiosity burned. The next week, he decided to follow her. After school, he grabbed his bike and waited near the garage. When Clara backed out of the driveway, he followed at a safe distance, pedaling furiously to keep up with her car. His heart raced as they wound through the quiet streets of town. But instead of heading toward the yoga studio, Clara turned onto the highway and kept driving. Jacob's stomach churned as he realized they were leaving town. He stayed back, his legs burning as he pedaled harder. Finally, after nearly half an hour, Clara pulled into the parking lot of a dingy motel on the outskirts of the city. Jacob skidded to a stop, ducking behind a bush as he watched her step out of the car. She wasn't carrying a yoga mat. Instead, she held a large manila envelope, her knuckles white as she gripped it tightly. She glanced around nervously before heading into one of the motel rooms. Jacob stayed hidden, his heart pounding. What was she doing here? And who was she meeting? Clara emerged from the motel room 15 minutes later, accompanied by a man in a baseball cap. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a leather jacket that looked worn from years of use. The two of them spoke in hushed tones, their faces tense. Clara handed him the envelope, and he slipped it into his jacket before walking away. Jacob fumbled for his phone, snapping a blurry photo of the scene. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about the motel. What was in the envelope? Why was Clara meeting with a man his dad had never mentioned? He needed more answers. The opportunity came the following weekend when Clara left her laptop open on the dining table. Tom had gone to pick up groceries, leaving Jacob alone in the house. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before sitting down at the laptop. The screen was unlocked, displaying a folder labeled Personal. Jacob's fingers trembled as he clicked on it. At first, the files seemed harmless. Wedding plans, catering invoices, photos of her and Tom. But then, one file caught his attention. It was titled Background Check. Inside was a scanned police report from 5 years ago. The name at the top made Jacob's blood run cold. Clara Hastings. The document detailed charges of fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement, though many of the charges had been dismissed. The final note read, "Suspect remains unaccounted for." Jacob stared at the screen, his heart hammering in his chest. His soon-to-be stepmother was a criminal. But how could he prove it to his dad? The house was quiet, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the stillness. Jacob sat at the dining table, staring at the open laptop in front of him. His heart thudded in his chest as he reread the police report for the 5th time. Fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. These were words Jacob had only seen in movies or his detective books, and now they were staring back at him, tied to the woman his dad was about to marry. He scrolled down, his fingers trembling. The report was lengthy, detailing a scheme where Clara, then using her real name, Clara Hastings, had conned multiple people out of tens of thousands of dollars. She had posed as a financial advisor, promising her victims lucrative returns on fake investments. When the scheme fell apart, she vanished, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions. At the bottom of the report, a photo was attached. Jacob squinted at the image of a younger Clara, her hair slightly darker but unmistakably her. Her eyes, though framed by a forced smile, held something cold, something calculating. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. Jacob shut the laptop abruptly, pushing it away as if it might explode. His mind raced. He had found proof that Clara wasn't who she claimed to be. But what could he do with it? His dad was so happy, so in love. How could Jacob tell him that the woman he was about to marry was a fraud? And what if Clara found out? The memory of her icy glare the night he overheard her phone call sent shivers through him. She wouldn't just brush this off. Jacob had no doubt she would do whatever it took to protect her secret. He sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. Finally, he grabbed his notebook and began to write. Clara Hastings, confirmed criminal. Police report attached. Questions. Why hasn't she been caught? What does she want from Dad? Does Dad know? Plan. Find more evidence. Make sure Dad believes me. Keep safe. Over the next few days, Jacob became obsessed with filling in the gaps. He knew there was more to the story, something that explained why Clara had come into their lives and what her endgame was. Armed with his notebook and the blurry photo he'd taken at the motel, Jacob set out to find answers. His first stop was the library. The small, quiet building on the edge of town was one of Jacob's favorite places. The librarian, Mrs. Henley, greeted him with a warm smile as he entered. "Back for more detective books?" she asked, her glasses slipping down her nose. "Not today," Jacob said, trying to sound casual. "I need to look up people. Like, if someone's done bad stuff, can I find out about it?" Mrs. Henley raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Well, public records might have what you're looking for. Just be careful, okay? Some things are better left alone." Jacob swallowed hard. He knew she was right, but he couldn't stop now. Not when his dad's happiness, and maybe his safety, was at stake. That evening, Jacob found himself back on the dining room floor, his notebook open and the laptop humming softly. He scoured every corner of the internet, piecing together fragments of Clara's life before she met his dad. Most of it led to dead ends, fake names, false addresses. But one thread stood out: a man named Victor Russo. The name had appeared in one of Clara's emails, listed as a business associate. A quick search revealed that Victor Russo was a known con artist with ties to a string of fraudulent schemes across the state. Jacob's stomach churned as he realized the man Clara had met at the motel matched Victor's description perfectly. Jacob knew he needed more than just a hunch. He needed hard evidence to convince his dad, and fast. With trembling fingers, he drafted an email to the local police department, attaching the scanned report and the motel photo. He hesitated before hitting send, his cursor hovering over the button. What if he was wrong? What if Clara really had changed? He thought about his dad's face, so full of hope every time he talked about the wedding. But then he thought about the cold calculation in Clara's eyes, the sharp tone of her voice on that phone call. Jacob clicked send. The next morning, Jacob was eating breakfast when Clara entered the kitchen. Her usual smile seemed strained, and she moved with a nervous energy that set Jacob on edge. "Good morning, Jacob," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Did you sleep well?" Jacob nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He kept his eyes on his cereal, but he could feel her gaze burning into him. "You've been awfully quiet lately," Clara continued, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "Is everything okay?" Jacob's heart raced. Did she know? Had she seen the email? He forced himself to shrug. "I'm fine." Clara leaned forward, her smile thinning. "You know, Jacob, it's important to be honest, especially with family. Secrets can be very dangerous." Jacob froze, his spoon hovering mid-air. Was that a threat? He mumbled something about needing to finish his homework and bolted from the table, his pulse pounding in his ears. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling when he heard it, a soft creak like a footstep in the hallway. He sat up, his heart hammering. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he saw a shadow move. Someone was outside. Jacob's mind raced. Should he call out? Hide? Before he could decide, the shadow disappeared, and he heard the faint sound of the stairs creaking. He waited until the house was silent again before slipping out of bed and tiptoeing to the hallway. Clara's door was closed, but Jacob's instincts told him she wasn't asleep. Something about the way her shadow had lingered outside his room felt deliberate, like she wanted him to know she was there. The following day, Jacob's dad received a phone call. It was from the police. They had reviewed the report and the photo Jacob had sent and confirmed that Clara was under investigation. When Tom confronted her, Clara's mask slipped entirely. She denied it at first, laughing off the accusations and calling them ridiculous. But when Tom showed her the evidence Jacob had found, her expression darkened. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed at Jacob, her voice low and venomous. Tom stepped between them, his face pale. "Clara, is this true?" For a moment, Clara said nothing. Then, as if a switch had flipped, she turned and bolted for the door. Tom called after her, but she didn't stop. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. The police had arrived. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that seemed almost too perfect. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the small church, bathing the pews in a warm, golden glow. Guests were already filing in, their laughter and cheerful chatter filling the air. But for Jacob, it felt like the walls were closing in. He sat in the front pew next to his dad, holding the small satin pillow that carried the wedding rings. His fingers fidgeted with the edges, his stomach twisting in knots. Clara was somewhere in the back room getting ready. He hadn't seen her since last night's confrontation, and the memory of her venomous words still sent chills down his spine. "You okay, champ?" Tom asked, leaning down to meet Jacob's eyes. His voice was calm, but his face betrayed a trace of worry. "You've been quiet all morning." Jacob swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm fine, Dad." But he wasn't fine. His chest felt heavy, like a boulder was pressing down on it. He had tried so hard to warn his dad, but Tom had insisted the wedding would go on as planned. "She'll explain everything," Tom had said. "It's probably a misunderstanding." Jacob wanted to believe that, but deep down, he knew better. The music swelled, signaling the start of the ceremony. Everyone turned to watch as the bridesmaids glided down the aisle, their pastel dresses fluttering. Then came Clara. She stepped into view, her gown shimmering in the sunlight. She looked every bit the picture-perfect bride, her face serene as she made her way toward the altar. But Jacob couldn't shake the memory of the cold, calculating look she'd given him the night before. As Clara reached the front, she took Tom's hands, her smile radiant. The minister began to speak, his voice warm and steady as he welcomed the guests. Jacob sat frozen, his heart pounding. The words blurred together as the minister talked about love and commitment, but all Jacob could think about was the folder on Clara's laptop, the motel meeting, and the police report. Then came the question, if anyone here has reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. Jacob's breath hitched. His palms were slick with sweat. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading and preparing for. He looked at his dad, who was gazing at Clara with nothing but love in his eyes. His throat tightened. He has to know. Slowly, Jacob stood. The guests murmured in confusion, and all eyes turned to him. His voice trembled as he said, I have something to say. Tom turned, his brows furrowing. Jacob, what's going on? Jacob's hands shook, but he held the pillow tightly, grounding himself. Dad, you can't marry her. She's lying to you. Gasps rippled through the room. Clara's face remained composed, but her eyes flickered with something dark. Jacob, she said sweetly, though her tone was strained. This isn't the time for jokes. I'm not joking, Jacob shot back, his voice gaining strength. She's not who she says she is. Her name isn't even Clara. It's Clara Hastings, and she's wanted by the police. Tom blinked, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to form words but couldn't. The room erupted into whispers, the guests exchanging shocked glances. Clara's smile faltered. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice laced with irritation. She turned to Tom, her expression pleading. He's a kid, Tom. He doesn't understand what he's saying. But Jacob wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening the photo of Clara at the motel. I saw you meet this man, he said, holding it up for everyone to see. You gave him an envelope. I saw it. Clara's eyes widened, and for the first time she looked genuinely rattled. That's enough, she snapped, her voice sharp. She took a step toward Jacob, but Tom moved between them, his hand raised. Wait, Tom said, his voice shaking. What is he talking about, Clara? Who is this man? Clara hesitated, her mouth twitching as if she were searching for the right words. Then, as if a mask had been ripped away, her entire demeanor changed. The sweet, loving bride was gone, replaced by someone colder and harder. Fine, she said, her voice low and venomous. You want the truth? Yes, I met him, but it's not what you think. What is it then? Tom demanded, his face pale. Clara sneered. It's none of your business. The room was in chaos now. Some guests stood, whispering furiously, while others remained frozen, their faces etched with disbelief. Tom took a step back, his voice rising. None of my business? I'm about to marry you! Clara laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the church. You think you know me, Tom? You don't know anything. At that moment, the doors at the back of the church burst open, and 2 police officers strode in, their badges glinting in the light. Clara Hastings, one of them said loudly. You're under arrest. Clara froze, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Then, without warning, she bolted, her heels clattering against the marble floor. The officers gave chase, and within seconds they had her pinned near the altar. The guests watched in stunned silence as the officers cuffed Clara and read her rights. Her once perfect appearance was now disheveled, her face twisted in rage. You think this is over? She snarled, her eyes locking onto Jacob. You've made a big mistake, kid. The church slowly emptied as the guests filed out, still murmuring about the shocking turn of events. Jacob sat on the steps outside, his head resting in his hands. He felt exhausted, like he had run a marathon. Tom sat down next to him, his face drawn and tired. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tom sighed and pulled Jacob into a tight hug. You were right, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved me, Jake. I don't know how to thank you. Jacob leaned into his dad's embrace, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. I didn't want you to get hurt. Tom nodded, his eyes glistening. I should have listened to you sooner. I'm sorry. As they sat there, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Clara's lies had nearly destroyed their family, but Jacob's courage had saved the day. Police cars' flashing lights disappeared into the distance, taking Clara and her secrets away for good. The church parking lot, once filled with laughter and celebration, was now eerily quiet. Guests had trickled away, murmuring their disbelief, leaving Jacob and Tom sitting alone on the front steps. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Tom stared at the ground, his face pale and drawn, while Jacob picked at the fraying edges of his suit jacket, unsure of what to say. He had done what he set out to do, protected his dad, but the weight of it all still sat heavily on his young shoulders. Finally, Tom broke the silence. Jake, he began, his voice hoarse. How did you know? Jacob looked up at his dad, his eyes wide and hesitant. I didn't at first, he admitted. But I noticed things, little things. She didn't act the same when you weren't around. And then I found the report on her laptop. Tom's brows knit together. You were snooping on her laptop? Jacob winced. I know I shouldn't have. But she was acting so weird, Dad. She lied about where she was going, and I heard her talking on the phone one night. She said she'd take care of him. I thought she might hurt you. Tom let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. I can't believe I didn't see it. You were happy, Jacob said softly. She made you happy. I didn't want to ruin that. Tom shook his head, his jaw tightening. She didn't make me happy, Jake. She made me believe something that wasn't real. You're the one who kept it real. You saw what I couldn't. Tom's voice cracked as he continued. What else did you find? Jacob hesitated, then pulled his notebook from his jacket pocket. The pages were crumpled and covered in his scrawling handwriting. He handed it to his dad, his fingers trembling. I wrote everything down. The police report, the photo from the motel, the emails. I thought if I showed you, you might believe me. Tom flipped through the notebook, his face a mixture of pain and admiration. Each entry detailed the little things Jacob had noticed: Clara's odd behavior, the Thursday yoga trips, the suspicious emails. On the last page was a simple line that made Tom's throat tighten. I just want Dad to be safe. Jake. Tom's voice broke, and he pulled his son into another hug. You shouldn't have had to do all this. I should have been the one protecting you. Jacob clung to his dad, feeling a lump rise in his throat. I didn't want to lose you, too. The days that followed were quiet, almost surreal. Tom canceled the reception, returned the rented tuxedos, and made the difficult calls to explain why the wedding was off. Word spread quickly in their small town, and while most people were sympathetic, a few couldn't resist the urge to gossip. Jacob stayed close to his dad during this time, worried about how he was handling everything. Tom tried to put on a brave face, but Jacob could see the cracks. He knew his dad wasn't just mourning the relationship, he was mourning the trust that had been shattered. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old action movie, Tom turned to Jacob. You know, he said, I've been thinking about what you did. How you saw through Clara when I couldn't. That was brave, Jake. Really brave. Jacob shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want her to hurt you. Tom smiled faintly. You're a good kid, Jake. Smarter than I give you credit for. Jacob looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. I was scared, Dad. What if I was wrong? Tom ruffled his son's hair, his expression softening. Then we'd have figured it out together. But you weren't wrong. You were looking out for me, and that means more than anything. Weeks later, life began to settle back into a normal rhythm. The house felt quieter without Clara's constant presence, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet. Tom started taking time off work to spend with Jacob, bike rides in the park, movie nights, even baking disastrous batches of cookies together. One afternoon, Jacob found Tom sitting in the garage, tinkering with an old bike. Hey, buddy, Tom said, glancing up. Thought we could fix this up for you. Jacob grinned. Really? You mean it? Of course, Tom said, handing Jacob a wrench. It's about time we did something fun, just the two of us. As they worked side by side, the tension that had lingered between them since the wedding began to melt away. For the first time in weeks, Jacob felt like things might actually be okay. The story of Jacob stopping his dad's wedding spread beyond their town, capturing headlines and sparking debates online. Kid detective exposes criminal stepmom, one article read, accompanied by a photo of Jacob and Tom sitting on their front porch. People marveled at Jacob's courage, but for him, it wasn't about being brave. It was about protecting the people he loved. One night, as Tom tucked him into bed, Jacob asked, Do you think Clara will come back? Tom hesitated before shaking his head. She won't, Jake. The police have her now, and they'll make sure she doesn't hurt anyone else. Jacob nodded, though the thought still made his chest tighten. I don't get why she did it. Why she pretended to love you. Tom sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. Some people, Jake, only care about themselves. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want, even if it means hurting others. But you're not like that, Jacob said firmly. And neither am I. Tom smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Jacob's forehead. That's right, buddy. And as long as we stick together, We'll be okay." As the weeks turned into months, the memory of Clara began to fade, replaced by new routines and a stronger bond between father and son. Jacob never forgot the lessons he'd learned, that even the people who seem perfect can hide dark secrets, and that sometimes the truth requires courage to uncover. On a sunny Saturday, as Jacob and Tom rode their bikes through the park, Jacob glanced over at his dad and smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt light, like the weight of the past had finally lifted. "Hey, Dad," Jacob called out, his voice carrying over the warm breeze. "Race you to the lake." Tom laughed, standing on his pedals to catch up. "You're on." As they sped down the path, the sound of their laughter filled the air, a reminder that even after heartbreak and betrayal, love and trust could still find a way to heal.